Morning, everyone. I am Min Jung Kim, the Barbara B. Taylor Director of the St. Louis Art Museum, and I'm so pleased to be with you this morning. In 2010, Carolyn Danforth and the Danforth Foundation dramatically transformed the presence of Native American art at the St. Louis Art Museum. Through multiple gifts, including 250 works of art from the Donald Danforth Jr. collection, the Danforth family ensured that Native American art contributes to the global stories of artistic achievement that the museum shares with the people of St. Louis. I encourage you to visit the Danforth Gallery on the third floor of the museum and to see for yourself selections from this deep and remarkable collection of embroidery, painting, and sculpture. In addition to installing the gallery, the museum published the catalog Plains Indian Art of the Early Reservation Era, the Donald Danforth Jr. Collection at the St. Louis Art Museum. We are so grateful to Carolyn Danforth and her family for their vision and generosity. I hope you will all please join me in thanking the Danforth family for this support of the museum and its program. Our exceptional SLAM team plays a vital role in maintaining, showcasing, and safeguarding our collection, as well as enhancing its value to scholarly endeavors. And in that regard, I would like to acknowledge my colleague, Alexander Breer-Marr, the Associate Curator for Native American Art, who is responsible for the ongoing research and display of the Danforth collection. Together, we gather for the 12th annual Danforth Jr. Lecture on Native American Art. Our speaker, Jessica L. Horton, is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Delaware. Her forthcoming book, Earth Diplomacy, Indigenous American Art, Ecological Crisis in the Cold War, examines how artists revitalized indigenous cultures of diplomacy to place the earth itself at the center of international relations. Her previous book is Art for an Undivided Earth, the American Indian Movement, published by Duke University Press. Her writing has appeared in Art in America, Art Journal, and Third Text, and she has contributed multiple chapters to exhibition catalogs and edited volumes. The recipient of numerous awards and grants, Jessica has been a fellow at the Getty Research Center, Smithsonian American Art Museum, and National Museum of the American Indian, Clark Art Institute, and the Center for the Advanced Study in the Visual Arts. Jessica has a PhD and MA in Visual and Cultural Studies from the University of Rochester and a BA from the University of California, San Diego. Please join me in welcoming Jessica to the St. Louis Art Museum.
Good morning, everyone. I'm extremely honored to be here with you today in the homelands of the Osage Nation and the Illini Confederacy and so many other Native peoples who have crossed these lands across centuries. I want to begin with a huge thank you to Associate Curator Alex Marr for inviting me to share this work today, Jessica Kennedy for arranging my trip, and Carolyn Danforth for establishing this wonderful lecture series. It was such a treat to meet the whole family this morning. Just looking at the past list of speakers who came before me, I'm dazzled by the company I'm keeping. It's especially a delight. Oops, there's a little delay, I'll practice. It's especially a delight to present my research on Darrell Blackman, a Blackfeet Nation lodge maker who was working during the Cold War period at a museum with a renowned collection of historical Plains arts. The Danforth collection includes a number of remarkable works by Niitsitapi, or Blackfeet artists, working in the late 19th century, who are Blackman's relatives and teachers, including a stunning pipe bag beaded with floral patterns, this parfleche with geometric designs that I got to see in the gallery today, a materiality that echoes the art of painted lodges. This amazing hand drum painted with concentric rings that reminds me of the teepee encampment, as well as equestrian figures that ride the rings. And finally, that wonderful leather knife case featuring a vivid, vibrant pair of yellow triangles that also are reminiscent to me of the iconic shape of the teepee. As you'll see in my talk today, I'm really interested in how 20th century Native artists like Blackman establish both deep continuities as well as innovative departures from the well of artistic knowledge and cultural protocols passed down to him from his ancestors. To begin, I'm going to take us, however, far from this country in its entirety because we're headed to Osaka, Japan, where at the center of Expo 70, touted as the first Asian World Fair and the largest mega exposition in history, stood a lodge. Its canvas cover hosted paintings of crows and buffalo, constellations, fallen stars, and jagged mountain peaks. These are the non-human beings and the contours of the Blackfeet Confederacy homeland, a vast swath of plains and ridges that stretch across the United States-Canadian border from Alberta to Montana. Officials of the US government commissioned this 19-foot-tall lodge from a young artist named Darrell Blackman, a citizen of the Blackfeet Nation, which is headquartered in Browning, Montana. And the teepee towered over displays of pomo baskets, Pueblo pottery, and Navajo textiles in the folk art section of the pavilion. The fair as a whole was attended by a record-breaking 64 million visitors, and Expo 70 was charged with simulating the city of the future. Competing nations offered dazzling technological solutions to Cold War aggressions and warnings of global environmental collapse. The United States' claim to the overarching theme of progress and harmony for mankind included a restaging of the Apollo 11 moon landing inside a supersized elliptical dome. Based on a NASA design seen here, the low-profile pneumatic megastructure was intended to one-up Buckminster Fuller's famous geodesic pavilion for the United States in Montreal just 3 years earlier, ideally this time without leaking. Never mind its resemblance to a pincushion, the press release bragged that this was the largest and lightest clear-span air-supported roof ever built, capable of withstanding all natural forces, including earthquakes and 125-mile-per-hour typhoon winds. This floating waffle, as it was affectionately called by some, promised to land, I quote from the press release, wherever a controlled environment is desired, unquote. And so this pavilion architecture proposed a universal solution to earthly degradation and climatic extremity. It was a kind of unassuming spaceship, a homespun architecture designed to advance the cosmic frontiers of capitalism and the space race, and a singular future for mankind. Located on the topmost floor of the pavilion, the teepee's bouquet of 18 wooden support poles stretched toward the arc of the supersized roof, begging a question of the teepee's relationship to the dome, a dominant architectural paradigm that popped up in hippie communes and world fairs alike in the 1960s and 70s. And it was stumbling on juxtapositions like this one in archives while I was serving in a postdoctoral fellowship in Washington, D.C. about a decade ago, with Amy Torbert, your own curator here, was there with me at the time. And stumbling on moments like this in the archive challenged me to take a fresh look at the story of American art and diplomacy during the Cold War. This is a crowded field of scholarship, and it's largely centered on the interests of the United States government, corporate allies, and art world elites. And what the Lodge suggested to me was that Indigenous people, along with their non-human kin, their value systems, political priorities, and techniques of diplomatic persuasion were also present and shaping international relations. The teepee joins a wide array of forgotten Native art that traveled under the auspices of the US government's Cold War offensive. And my forthcoming book, Earth Diplomacy, Indigenous American Art, Ecological Crisis and the Cold War, charts the creative revitalization of these indigenous cultures of diplomacy across 2 decades and 5 continents. These arts rejoined, really, an international system from which Indigenous Americans and their non-human relations were systematically expelled by the mid-20th century. The US Information Agency, which was responsible for administering the nation's cultural diplomatic programs during the Cold War, was established in 1953, right at the same time as a federal policy known as Indian termination was formalized. And this suite of policies worked to cancel the lingering status of Native communities as sovereign nations, assimilate citizens into a capitalist economy, and open remaining homelands to mining, drilling, and other corporate interests. And more broadly, thinking through the lens of Indigenous people's experience of this period, I've come to see the Cold War itself as a kind of expanding zone of resource extraction, as dominant nations' competing bids to modernize the globe dictated the shape of international relations and accelerated the exploitation of a large majority of planetary life, both human and non-human. And I think we're living through the vast failures of that imagination today in the form of climate change and other large-scale political disasters. Indigenous artists responded to these dire conditions in their own times and places by engendering practices of what I call earth diplomacy, sensuous material exchanges that invite political alliances that include the land itself. Before and throughout the colonization of the Americas, Native leaders treated non-human beings and systems, plants, animals, rivers, mountains, weather, as diplomatic agents in their negotiations with strangers. Rituals, regalia, and gifts worked to forge political relationships that were founded in kinship and reciprocity with the entire living cosmos. Native artists adapted and reinvented these practices on the global terrain of the Cold War, both participating in and in many ways challenging the United States campaign abroad during the Cold War. Their arts were enlivened with affect and spirit in excess of government scripts. To understand how a painted lodge became an agent of Blackfeet earth diplomacy, I want to begin by exploring the relationship between the teepee and the dome. Variants on both of these flexible architectural genres were circulating throughout the 60s and 70s as emblems of environmental sustainability and countercultural cool. And I want to share just a couple of examples here. Conical tents stood beside patchwork domes and zones at experimental communes such as Drop City, New Buffalo, and Libre in the southwestern United States. Moving abroad, the spire of the six-sided teepee-like Indians of Canada pavilion looked across at Bucky's famous bubble at Expo 67 in Montreal. And guides to DIY teepee making accompanied treatises on pneumatic structures in the counterculture's beloved Whole Earth Catalog, published from 1968 to 1971. And I want you to look to that center cover image. because underwriting the popularity of teepees and domes were the first NASA satellite images of the planet viewed from outer space. Whole Earth images gave rise to a whole new consciousness of the interconnectedness and the fragility of our planetary ecosystem. And this included an ecstatic architectural discourse that celebrated the holism of circular, spherical, and elliptical forms. The teepee and the dome within this story shared a kind of mythical status as other, as a radical alternative to a colonizing rectilinearity in architectural tradition. In his influential Dome Cookbook of 1968, the environmental designer Steve Baer voiced an ethos obsessed with breaking out of the orthogonal prison of Western architecture. He asked whether the cube was officially dead, or was it, in fact, I quote, another type of life form that with its characteristic grid is slowly taking over the planet like some kind of galactic impetigo, unquote. And I had to look that one up. An impetigo is apparently a skin infection, but I think he's making a reference to alien invasion here, right? Drop City resident Bill Voigt put it simply, corners constrict the mind, and Voigt longed to be, I quote, closer in harmony with natural structure and celestial spheres. But compared to an extensive scholarship examining the proliferation of dome architecture in this period, the contemporaneous revitalization of the indigenous teepee has a much smaller, gained much smaller attention. And I think the reasons for this are not surprising. Along with all manner of ecological Indians and their arts, teepees were assigned a familiar place as markers of the nation's deep past, a pre-colonial world in which natives supposedly lived in harmony with natural cycles. In this eerie parade of headdresses that crossed the ceiling of Buckminster Fuller's 1967 pavilion, we've been here before, right? And in the tier on the right that rolled down Iron Eyes Cody's cheek, in the Keep America Beautiful anti-litter ad campaign a few years later, natives and their Italian stand-ins were ghostly witnesses to modernity, resurrected to passively mourn the loss of pure nature from the sidelines of the avant-garde. In architect and publisher Lloyd Kahn's Dome Book 2 of 1971, the teepee is invoked as an ancestor to the dome. The preface features an excerpt from Black Elk Speaks, a 1932 book written by American writer John Nearhart, based partially on the narrative of Lakota elder Black Elk. When it was reprinted in 1961, it had a huge audience, and it was also came under some criticism by scholars and Native people for perhaps embellishing Plains lifeways to please white audiences. And I want to read from that introductory preface. The power of the world always works in circles, and everything tries to be round. I have heard that the earth is round like a ball. Our teepees are round like the nests of birds, and these were always set in a circle, the nation's hoop, a nest of many nests, where the Great Spirit meant for us to hatch our children. But the white men have put us in these square boxes. Our power is gone, and we are dying, for there can be no power in a square. But there is another world, unquote. So this excerpt from Black Elk Speaks seems to link, it provides a way for linking dome building to the moral and spiritual order of Plains cultures, and through them, the very nature of the cosmos. But this is where the teepee parts ways with the dome. For in the rest of the manual, the teepee gives way to, I quote, a new indigenous architecture in the deserts, valleys, and mountains of America, unquote. Here, Black Elk's Another World is relegated to the one world of the dome, and the teepee makes no claim on the future. Perhaps this origin myth soothed countercultural anxieties about the technocratic origins and growing Cold War military applications of dome architecture. For by the time Fuller had patented his iconic version in 1954, the US military was using geodesics to spot Soviet bombers in the Arctic. And after that, dome variants became the preferred architecture of both national and corporate pavilions at world fairs. I'm showing you two more examples of other domes that cropped up at Expo 70 and Fuller in Moscow in 59 next to one of his early pavilions. Fuller himself embraced the teepee as ancestor narrative in a famous interview published later in Dome Book 2. He talked about arriving at a system in which one could go into the forest and, I quote, take those short little saplings and produce a beautiful geodesic truss dome. And I saw then that this was something going back to the art of the Indian and doing proper tying, unquote. For Fuller, and I want to continue quoting from this interview, the gap between the naked illiterate native and what I can do with my head and hands, unquote, was trigonometry. And as he traveled the world bearing the gift of mathematical knowledge, he was able to, I quote again, infect the natives with great enthusiasm for geodesics. Now they could get into quite large, absolutely free, clear span space control and have a higher advantage over nature, unquote. Teepees here become the linchpin of what the scholar Mark Rifkin calls settler time. The normativity, universality, and inevitability of progress, conceived by countercultural dropouts and Cold Warriors alike as a straight line, not a circle. Of course, this is just one version of the story. I'm showing you here a plain white teepee, which became the cover image of the American Indian Movement occupation of Alcatraz Island in 1971. And this is here just as a placeholder to remind us, as it did for me when I first saw it, that teepees have always simultaneously been agents of instability, of indigenous futures, right, that insistently present themselves at the heart of colonial spaces and claims to the future. And it's really to the sensuous power of Blackfeet teepee designs that I want to turn now in the remainder of my talk, in order to introduce a very different idea of holism, one that is anchored in circular reciprocity as the foremost principle of Blackfeet geopolitics, and one that I will suggest was activated by the Crow Lodge as an agent of Earth diplomacy at Expo 70. So this is the Crow Lodge. It's erected on the snowy lawn of the Museum of the Plains Indian in Browning, Montana in 1969, readied for shipment to Japan. It's the best color image I have. And the vivid designs that you see here and on all Blackfeet painted teepees map a three-tiered universe that is traversed by non-human allies and guardians. As Blackfeet elder Howard Rides at the Door told me, I quote, "A white teepee is just a teepee, but a painted teepee is a tabernacle," unquote. The inky crown of the cone marks a place of storied constellations and the sun, the source of all vitality in the world. In the creamy field, bisected by the bloodline of buffalo, lies a middle world, the zone of terrestrial life, and of more than human kinships and alliances that help to keep the cosmos in motion and in balance. In the heavy base below, underneath that fringe of mountains, is a watery underworld, host to the fallen children of the stars. The songs and stories associated with the Crow Lodge tell of a human hunter who gave his stash of buffalo meat to hungry crows long in the past. And it turned out that these were not ordinary crows, but powerful crow beings. They rewarded the selfless hunter with gifts, the crow teepee design, instructions for its stewardship and replication in the future, and associated songs, stories, and prayers. And finally, the right to this original hunter to become a leader of his people. Together, this bundle of material and intangible goods makes up what I'll refer to in the rest of my talk as the Crow Teepee Praxis. This is a form of spiritual and political wealth that governs the material expression of a particular painted lodge. So it's bigger than any one teepee, and it shapes the production and the transfer of teepees. As Joseph Gladstone and Donald Papillon have argued, Blackman's ancestors used painted teepee praxis to underwrite an ethical form of Blackfeet governance. Individuals advanced to leadership based on their generosity, their prowess, and their vision, and the mobile bands of the far-flung Blackfoot Confederacy, the Niitsitapi, gathered annually on the plains for ceremony, as they currently do for powwow today. The teepees would be arranged in a vast semicircular camp, and at the center would stand the painted lodges, evidence of the spiritual endowments and political legitimacy of their caretakers. Councils would be held inside the concentric rings of teepee and camp, and leaders there would seek consensus on decisions impacting the peaceful cohabitation of the prairies by both human and non-human communities. Anthropologist Brian Noble has termed these alliances treaty ecologies, underscoring the central role that plant and animal nations play in customary Blackfeet diplomacy. Non-human beings attend and participate in the political process, and they do so by way of the painted lodge because the vivid designs on the covers of teepees don't just symbolize agency out there in the environment. Paintings manifest. They make real and present the strength and protection bestowed on worthy humans by crows, buffalo, and other animal relations. Treaty ecologies and teepee praxis work together to guarantee that human authority is limited and shared with other beings that populate the cosmos. And individuals are then expected to transfer their rights, both to teepees and to leadership, to another in a timely fashion, roughly every 4 years, in order to recirculate political and spiritual power through a merit-based gift economy. At the time of Osaka 70, the US government had long worked to sever tribal leadership from the customary values embedded in painted lodges. Darrell Blackman, the maker of the Crow Lodge and the caretaker of the praxis associated with it, was only 28 at the time when he received this commission. He's pictured here in family photographs wearing buckskin regalia of his own making. He was born into the Blackfeet Nation in Montana, as I mentioned. This is one of the 4 nations making up the larger Niitsitapi or Blackfoot Confederacy. And at the time, the Blackfeet Nation was really devastated by poverty, by a US government relocation program that sent young Native men into urban slums, and by an epidemic of alcoholism. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had installed a business-friendly tribal government in the 1920s, and this group competed with the authority of culture keepers in the community. Oil leases came to replace buffalo hunts as the economic foundation of the nation. And at stake was, as Blackfeet scholar Betty Bastian has written, I quote, "living in the circle, the consciousness that everything is connected and has consequences. Government and business have made every effort to seduce Niitsitapi to forfeit this principle." Unquote. I found almost nothing written on Darrell Blackman when I began the research, so in the summer of 2022, I headed to North American Indian Days in Browning, Montana. This was the first such event to be held since the pandemic, so it was really my first opportunity to go. And it's an annual campout and powwow that's attended by the far-flung members of the Confederacy across that US-Canadian border. I spoke with families sharing barbecue around the base of painted teepees, which still stand proudly at the center of things. There was no Crow Lodge to be found, but eventually I was guided through the density of Blackfeet kinship networks to the doorsteps of Bill Blackman, Darrell's nephew, and Doris Kickingwoman, one of his former closest friends, and now a respected elder, ceremonial leader and keeper of the Elk Lodge that I photographed here on the left. I learned from them that Blackman was one of a tiny group of peers who learned the ceremonies, songs, and material culture at this incredibly challenging moment for the Blackfeet Nation. He and his best friend, Howard Rides at the Door, were commissioned to lead ceremonies by members of their community, including the ceremonies designed to transfer teepee rights. According to Kicking Woman, Daryl was instrumental in continuing these traditions while, I quote, genocide was in full swing, unquote. Blackman was trained, I learned, in women's arts by his grandmother, Sippy. She was a Cree refugee and an herbal healer among the Blackfeet, and she taught him how to use a treadle to efficiently sew canvas covers, which would customarily have been women's work. He learned the ceremonies, meanwhile, from his great-uncle-in-law, Fish Wolf Robe, who transferred the Crow Lodge praxis, the rights to replicate the Crow Lodge, to Blackman. Roger Butterfly remembers his older half-brother as an intercultural translator. Butterfly would help him paint teepee covers when Blackman returned from his undergraduate studies at the University of Montana. And when Butterfly marveled at how quickly and accurately his relative could cut the canvas, Blackman joked, "You just have to know algebra and geometry," unquote. And I wondered when I heard that whether Buckminster Fuller would have appreciated the irony, because clearly Blackman is making a joke here that his women ancestors passed this mathematical knowledge down to him, right? Blackman regularly partnered with the Museum of the Plains Indian to create restorations and replicas of all manner of Blackfeet arts. Rides at the Door recalls helping his friend as well create an estimated 50 teepees in various designs for the Smithsonian and other institutions in the late 60s. Unfortunately, it's been very hard to find these because their names did not stay attached as makers. At one point, the duo started to switch from earth-based pigments gathered from the land to use commercial paints. This allowed them to decorate as many as 2 covers a day. And I'm showing you here photographs of Daryl's grandmother, Sippy, Butterfly, his half-brother, and other relatives and friends who would join to assist the artist in decorating, in this case, a yellow horse teepee cover on the lawn of the museum in 1969. This collaboration and embrace of new materials continued what Alex Marr has called a long-standing tradition of architectural experimentation on the plains. I love that phrase, the tradition of experimentation. Dorr notes that he and Blackman consulted with elders to ensure the design accuracy, smudged and prayed over the finished lodges, and folded the cover in a customary manner before taking each teepee to the post office. And these details suggest to me that Blackman cared for the transmission of teepee protocols within the Blackfeet Nation, even as he stretched them to create new forms for external agents. Blackman's friends and relatives lament the loss of cultural knowledge when he died of alcoholism in 1971 at the tragically young age of 30. The Crow Lodge for Expo 70 then was among one of the last teepees that Blackman made, and in this case, he chose to replicate the design for which he was the steward, the keeper of the praxis. Importantly, he did not transfer the praxis itself to Osaka or to the government agents there. He is recorded as its caretaker until just before his death. So essentially, he maintained the rights to the songs, stories, and replication capabilities associated with the lodge. He clearly made a distinction, right, between the commissioned object and this whole world of intangible rights. But I still want to propose that the teepee was not simply severed from the intangible values that give it meaning and power in a Blackfeet universe. Instead, Blackman adapted and redirected these principles toward diplomatic ends in Osaka. He recirculated gifts from the earth in ways that exceeded the capitalist terms of the paid commission, bringing a Blackfeet gift economy into the story. And I'm going to talk us through some of the ways that he did this. To begin, notice how Blackman made calculated decisions based on a familiar design repertoire. Representations of the Crow teepees across the 20th century show quite a bit of variance, actually. They could feature a thin or extremely thick red line at middle, a narrow serrated black band with a single line of orbs at the base, or they could omit the black foundation entirely. The Osaka Lodge represents the most replete design collection that I've seen. Note the thick, bright red band and 2 rows of fallen stars filling the unusually high, jagged black peaks at bottom. These extremes still conform to the customary design protocols governing the lodge, but they suggest Blackman's will to embolden and beautify the allowance. Blackman's paintings guaranteed, then, that the lodge would have a commanding visual and material presence, despite the fact that it was significantly reduced in size. So what do I mean? Well, United States officials requested a replica, approximately 2/3 the size of Blackman's personal lodge, which I'm showing you there on the right. Their instructions specified, I quote, "The diameter of the teepee base is to be 13 feet, the height including teepee poles not to exceed 19 feet. These measurements were clearly predetermined by the size of the platform in the folk art space in Osaka. And probably shipping such a large, heavy item was also a concern for the organizers. I read in the archive that the custom plywood crate packed with the cover and poles and reinforced with steel consumed 45 hours of labor and weighed about 1,000 pounds. These details underscore that the descaling of Blackman's Lodge stopped short of miniaturization. Plains artists have long created miniatures, both as teaching tools for children and, by the 19th century, on commission for museums and world fairs. I'm showing you here a petite teepee from the Danforth collection that's attributed to a Blackfeet artist. Some scholars have associated miniaturizing Indigenous architecture with trivializing and possessing it. Although I must say, Alex's work on Kiowa miniature teepees have convinced me that even a tiny lodge still has power. Nonetheless, a reduction in scale can cancel a teepee's status as a livable space, capable of gathering bodies. And so while the Crow Lodge fell on the small end of Blackfeet lodges designed for dwelling, it still retained its status as architecture. And this is important for what I want to articulate about the role it played in Osaka. Notice these photographs of the pavilion and how we see the lodge compelling intimate, tactile interactions from visitors. They're touching the flap of the open door, they're bending to peer inside, or they're craning their necks to follow the poles skyward. The concentration of these activities at the entrance to the lodge points to a potential for Congress inside. The door is open and it issues a welcome. And even if the invitation was never answered, and to my knowledge, no one ever went inside during the expo, the Crow teepee still presented itself to visitors as habitable and, by extension, hospitable. Compelled to linger at the door, visitors ignored other protocols governing the pavilion. Surveillance technologies and security forces were installed throughout to guarantee the efficient linear movement of about 10,000 visitors a day. And meanwhile, Japanese organizers coordinated an expo-wide crowd control program that translated into English as Operation Buffalo, designed to quell a stampede. To pause in collective wonderment, to activate touch instead of speedy visual experience, was to resist this rationalization of visitor flows throughout the pavilion and the expo. The lodge's sensuous invitation to gather translated a key Blackfeet concept into Expo 70. And that's the welcome and emplacement of newcomers within a circle of reciprocity that painted teepees are designed to expand. Generosity was embedded in the teepee in several other important ways. Blackman, in the end, donated his own personal set of teepee poles to the commission. This was a consequential offering. Poles are only harvested seasonally in the spring from pines in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. A well-seasoned set of poles is a treasured possession, and it would have cost the artist significant extra time and labor to replace them in order to erect his own lodge at North American Indian Days in 1970. This is my favorite part. I wish I had a better picture to show you this, but do look to the right. Blackman attached these little bonus gifts, pendants made of buckskin and painted bright red, to the mouths of every crow. As Kicking Woman shared with me when I showed her the images, these medallions mirror the historical practice of hanging skins and other sacred materials that are found in the environment on lodge exteriors to count coup, represent a good deed, or honor an animal gift. Blackman knew that as the Crow Lodge traveled to Osaka, it would be severed potentially from the stories and protocols that lent it sacred meaning in a Blackfeet universe. And I think it's really interesting that he chose to make literal the most significant feature of the lodge's origin story, recreating the hunter's treasured gift of buffalo meat to the crows, this time in deer flesh. These small additions had an outsized meaning, for they manifested the intangible principle that was most in danger of being lost in capitalist translation, and that is the principle of more than human reciprocity. I suggest that Blackman's inclusion of these elements positioned the Crow teepee to activate, rather than merely picture, new nodes in the circuit of Blackfeet gift exchange, making demands of both old Crow allies and potentially new allies in Osaka alike. Other decisions shaped the teepee's reception in this space. In collaboration with the staff of the Museum of the Plains Indian, Blackman developed a 25-page illustrated instruction manual. I only have a bad photocopy from the archive, so I had artists recreate a few diagrams for publication in my book that I'm showing you here. The manual is aimed at teaching novices in Osaka how to erect a teepee. Pretty practical, right? Normally, these lessons in a Blackfeet context would be transmitted through observation and mimicry, but here, notes and diagrams are crucial to translating Blackfeet protocols into portable form, where they could bridge significant gaps in time, space, and cultural fluency. On the receiving end in Osaka, users were challenged to reanimate the instructions in a real space. And as scholars have pointed out, diagrams and models don't just passively replicate the objects that they refer to. They actually both materially and conceptually alter the original, right? In this case, Blackman's personal lodge and the praxis that accompanies it. These diagrams in particular anticipate a need for translation, including modifications to the teepee's form. For example, the diagram on the right predicts a floor of wood or concrete rather than soil, and it specifies the creation of wooden shoes that could be nailed to the floor to prevent the poles from sliding. This is a literal hardening, right, of the teepee's foundation. And to me, it also brings up more of an abstract or conceptual hardening of the boundaries of the teepee, nudging the lodge toward the status of an aestheticized object rather than a spiritual conduit, right? It's no longer connected to the earth and reaching to the cosmos and so on. However, another note instructs the users to, I quote, determine the direction the teepee will face, unquote. Normally, a lodge would be erected to face the rising sun, which would bless and animate the lodge. The manual's authors clearly anticipated that the protocols of the exhibition space would supersede the Blackfeet cultural protocols governing the teepee's raising. But the diagrams also exert pressure in the other direction, resisting the total severing of the teepee, right, from the Blackfeet homeland and culture. For example, one diagram specifies how the ear flaps which is this dynamic element at the top that can be opened and closed to regulate ventilation, should be pulled open for display. Yes, this position maximizes the visual impact of the painted constellations on the flap, but it also ensured the circulation of breath and air, which are evidence of the sun's vitality in the world throughout the interior of the lodge. It allowed the lodge to breathe. And this detail suggests to me that translation went both ways, and that Blackman may have sought to retain the teepee's potential for Blackfeet cosmologies to manifest even in these strange foreign conditions of display. Perhaps the most significant function of the diagrams was to invite the lodge's foreign hosts into a tactile and embodied form of learning. To achieve a smooth and tight-fitting conical form without prior experience required a team of people, as we see in this image. Diagrams instructed users to adjust the poles by employing a, I quote, twisting, lifting action, unquote. This kind of exertion, we can imagine, right, required an intimate interaction, not only with the lodge, but with the other bodies that are gathered to erect the teepee. The manual users had to first conceptualize and then coordinate their actions to grapple with the enormous weight of the canvas, the length of the poles, and the precise tension and balance among elements. Success demanded intellectual, affective, and bodily commitment from a collective of people. It could not be mastered in a glance. These engagements with the teepee had the potential to generate what the geographer Jason Dittmer has called a diplomatic assemblage. In his account of international relations, the gathering of those who are involved in developing policies and imagining global togetherness is much more than a meeting of political identities that are just ready-made, right, formed in advance of the meeting. Instead, he suggests that diplomacy itself is shaped by the emotional charge that comes from the materials, the media, the objects, and the bodies and their practices that make up the space of gathering. Art, in other words, can have an impact on the political attitudes, the feelings, and thus the thoughts of those who are engaged in foreign policy making. The people you see in this image are actually putting up the teepee cover for a public ceremony at Osaka City Hall. A transfer of the Crow teepee is underway. At the close of Expo 70, the lodge was presented as a gift, ostensibly from the US government to Osaka. But if, as I've proposed, the teepee continued to activate Blackfeet sources of spiritual and political power, then who exactly was this gift from and to what ends? Those who witnessed this ceremony were left to search the Crow Lodge for answers. The avian and celestial figures, the pine bouquet, the open door, the buckskin pendants. And I want to propose in closing that the lodge was a dual gift from the artist and his crow protectors. And I want to quote the Potawatomi plant biologist Robin Wall Kemmerer, who says, I quote, "We inhabit a landscape of gifts, peopled by non-human relatives, the sovereign beings who sustain us," unquote. As evidence of this abundance, gifts implicate their receivers in a circuit of reciprocity that extends from human ambassadors to the bounty of the earth itself. Indigenous gifts make kin. They are designed to transform fleeting political encounters into long-term relationships, including mutual responsibilities to care for one another. By embedding Blackfeet notions of hospitality and generosity into the material form of the lodge, Blackman created the potential for a new diplomatic relationship to emerge, one that would draw strangers into an expanding circle of kinship and reciprocity. And in doing so, he insisted on the relevance of Indigenous art to a struggling system of international relations and the necessity of forging new treaty ecologies to sustain a collective future worth living. Thank you so much. for your patient listening. And this is just a gratitude slide of my own. So many more people than I included here have contributed to this work. Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of the most important thank yous. I'm also believe that I can welcome some questions. Terrific.
I was lucky enough to be able to help set up and sleep in teepees with Boy Scouts and also a mountain man reenactor. And it's an incredible experience. Supposedly the woman who owned them could set them up in half an hour. And with 6 helpers, it took us between 3 and 4 hours, but I'm sure with time it would get better. And also, have you visited the dome here at the Climatron at the Missouri Botanical Garden?
Is it a Buckminster Fuller
Yes.
design or derived from? No. I have a little time this afternoon, though. Thanks for the tip, and thank you for sharing your own experience with the weight and challenge of doing this.
I have a membership card if I can help you get in.
Very generous. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jess. I was so interested to see the objects surrounding the teepee at Expo 70. And so I was wondering if you could share something about how the teepee was both interpreted by organizers in that space, and then if there were relationships between, say, those wonderful ceramics in the background and it. Thanks.
So one of the things that interested me about the teepee in particular, and most of the other artworks that I chose to focus on in the book, was that they were created with great intention for the purposes of this international context. And so this gives the artist a chance to think about what happens to the teepee, right, when it is moved, when it undergoes this displacement from a Blackfeet cultural world and homeland and into this world of international relations. So I was trying not to make you all too dizzy. I wish I knew the magic button to go back to the start without exiting here. But all of these other artworks were borrowed from museums. Some of them were part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs New Deal era art collection. So these date back to primarily the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I do see, a relationship, trying to get back to, this is a long presentation. Get back to that original image so that you can see some of those objects. I believe that there are many wonderful things here that may have been created in the context of indigenous diplomatic exchange as well. We know that Pueblo communities were engaging, of course, in trade and diplomacy with Plains nations. So there's this whole world of inter-indigenous diplomacy that precedes and continues after colonization. And I see an opportunity in these Cold War exhibition spaces to bring those kinds of those latent diplomatic histories back into the conversation, right? Even though so many of these were collected in the 19th century and made their way into museum collections. They may have had or relate to items that participated in trans-indigenous diplomatic networks as well. And I talk a little bit about that in the book. But the teepee, has a special status because it was commissioned and created for the purpose of this space. And so this affords the maker special, I think, opportunities to encode diplomatic principles into the work. Thank you so much for your question.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. My question is this: what made you to decide to go into this field, meaning the Indian art? Do you have an architectural background, or did you want to relate that to architecture? What made you to do this?
Well, it's
Thank
perfect
you.
that there is thank you so much for your kind words and for your question. There's a million ways to talk about the why of choosing our life paths, as I'm sure you all know. But I was privileged to grow up as a non-native person in Pomo homelands in Northern California. I love that there are Pomo baskets actually in the display here in Osaka. I'm somehow always being pulled back to that history. But baskets and native art broadly was really my introduction to art history. And I remember it being a little bit of a shock when I went out into the world and realized that native art isn't everywhere. It's not always in every art museum or foregrounded as, you know, a leading call to the field of art history, where I ended up landing as a professor, teaching it now to a next generation. So you are all very, very lucky to have a museum with extraordinary native art collections, speaking to other arts of the world here. Yeah.
I think, can we take one more final question?
Thank you, Jessica. That was wonderful. I had a couple of questions, but I'll narrow it down to the one about the extent to which this event in Osaka might have triggered interest among Japanese audiences in their own Aboriginal or indigenous histories. I know there's a native population in northern Japan. I think that was original to Japan. So I was just curious about whether there was any engagement with that.
Yeah, there's a whole history that I can't do justice to now that actually kind of precedes Osaka 70. But there were these big collecting missions, including Japanese collectors, ethnographers, and so on, assembling native art collections for Osaka 70. And they actually engaged in some museum diplomacy leading up to that, exchanging Ainu indigenous material culture from Japan with various institutions in the United States in order to find an affordable way to build these native art collections. And so there was actually native art on display along with Ainu material culture and other indigenous arts of the world in various locations throughout the expo. So it's a great question. And yes, these World Fairs created a whole cascade of different kinds of diplomatic exchange. And the practice of museums exchanging indigenous collections in particular, I've found that goes back, you know, many decades before this one. And so they're kind of practicing a well-rehearsed tradition within the museum world at this point. Yeah.
Thank you so much to Jessica Horton, and thank you to all of you for being here today.
Thank you.